Welcome to Textile Update, the podcast where we can share our passion for textiles, fibers, and yarns. This is Gwendolyn Hustvedt.
This is the third of 4 episodes where I look at fancy weaves. In this episode, I'm going to get all into the world of pile weaves. In this next episode where I talk about fancy weaves, I'm going to talk about pile fabrics, only a couple of which are actually very fancy. Velvet, that's fancy. But carpeting, we don't really think of carpeting as fancy. In the next episode, I'll cover double cloths and textured weaves. But for now, we're going to focus on pile weaves. So these fabrics are fancy in the sense that they require a loom that is more complex than a basic loom. But the fanciness is really only that there's some kind of 3D structure that's been woven into a ground fabric, right? So typically yarns or fibers that stick up out of the surface of the fabric to give it a 3D nature. That's really kind of all. This 3D pile is typically created from a third set of yarns, right, that are either going in the warp direction or the filling direction. The pile can be loops that are sticking up out of the surface of the fabric, or so think of like terry cloth, or they can be cut, so think of like velvet, right? And so you can put your hands in those and you have to kind of dig your fingers down to find the fabric that's at the bottom of that fabric. Terry cloth it's almost hard to see the ground because it can have loops on both sides. But velvet, you can see when you turn it over, there's a flat side. That's what we're calling the ground. So to categorize these pile weaves, I'm basically going to talk about the different types of machines that produce it, and then tell you the fabrics that'll be produced with those machines. The first category of pile weaves would be something called a weft pile. A weft pile is where we add that third set of yarns going in the weft direction. We call it filling, but in industry it's called weft pile. So the filling yarns are very long floats. They're extra inserted yarns. We learned about those in dobby weaves. These extra inserted yarns are interlaced with the warp every so often. So we end up with long floats, and then they're interlaced, so it goes over maybe 7 or 8, and then it goes under. But unlike a satin where the over-under switches places randomly to give it a nice smooth surface, in this one, the very next filling yarn goes under the exact same one as the previous one. So we end up having this sort of woven valley where all of the filling floats go under that one yarn. And then we have this kind of ridge where all of the floats are floating between until they get to the next valley. So we end up kind of with this fabric that has long floats on the surface and stripes that go down in the warp direction. This is kind of the counterintuitive thing. Because we're putting the filling yarns in to do this, we call it a weft pile, but the stripes or the valleys go in the warp direction. We'll use that in a minute to help us identify or differentiate between different types of pile fabrics. After we're all done, we'll actually basically stick a special kind of scissor. It's sort of a metal rod that goes under the floats with a cutting disc that follows on top, and we'll stick it under those floats, and we'll cut the floats exactly in half. And then we'll brush them with a special brush, which we'll learn about in finishes, in order to brush them up. Now, the challenge with this is the taller we want to get what is called the rib, the little line of pile that's sticking up, kind of like a row of corn stalks. The taller we want to get that, the longer we have to make the float, because the height of the rib is half the float. But the taller we make the pile, the further apart the rows are. Right? There's this broad space between the ribs, and that exposes the ground. So we have to find the perfect balance. Of course, we're using a very low twist spun yarn so that as we cut it, it splays apart and creates this fuzzy surface. And you're kind of trying to picture it, aren't you? Well, if they're far enough apart that we can kind of see the space between them, we call it corduroy. Corduroy means cloth of the king, corduroy. And so although now we think of corduroy as sort of a 70s workman's type fabric, I know in the 70s I had a pair of purple corduroy knickers. My mom made them for me at the end of first grade, and gosh darn it, they were out of style by the time I got to second grade. It was my first and most horrible experience with fashion trends. I finally had something fashionable that my mother would make for me, not a Holly Hobbie dress with a little sunbonnet. And I finally had this fashionable pair of knickers, and by the time I got to second grade, they were over. But corduroy was a royal fabric and considered very lush, even though it's made with a spun yarn, so cotton typically. If we put the ribs a little bit closer together so that we can't really see the ground between them and brush them really hard, we get a fabric called velveteen. Remember how sateen was satin's poor country cousin because satin was made with silk and sateen was made with cotton? Same situation here. Velveteen is velvet's poor country cousin. And so you can very quickly identify the difference between velvet and velveteen because velveteen is a weft pile. So if you squeeze it or pinch it in the warp direction, so if you have a big bolt of cloth and you pinch it in the longwise direction, you'll be able to see the ground, the line of the ground between the ribs. Velvet, on the other hand, will not have that distinctive line. And so even if you don't test the fibers to see what they're made of, you'll be able to tell that one was produced in the weft direction and the other was produced in, you guessed it, the opposite direction, the warp direction. So warp piles are also made with a third set of yarns, and I'll talk about this in the next episode where I discuss double cloths. It's actually made by having this third set of yarns travel back and forth between two separate woven fabrics. So we actually weave two fabrics on top of each other, and the third yarn is woven under a yarn, a warp yarn filling yarn in the bottom fabric, and then it's raised up to be part of the top fabric where it's woven into with a filling yarn, and then it's lowered down, and then it's raised up, and it's lowered down, and it's raised up. And when it's all finished, we have this kind of fabric sandwich, and then it's very carefully cut apart. I recommend that you take a look online for a diagram of velvet made with the double cloth method, because I can't do it justice verbally, but this special machine, which has been around for centuries, is a Renaissance art, if not earlier, because it just basically uses a basic loom, right? It's just a plain weave, only two looms set on top of each other with this one warp that's being moved very simply between the two. So this is considered a warp pile because the third set of yarns go in the warp direction. Because we're not doing it in the little ridges, right, like we do in the weft pile, we can get the pile to be very long. And the distance between the two fabrics is the length of the pile, right, divided by 2. So if we pull the two fabrics further apart and weave this extra warp yarn between the two, then we can have taller pile. If we squeeze the fabric, we may see a bit of ground going in the side to side or crosswise direction, because that would be the places where the warp yarn was in the upper fabric, right? And so then it would just be woven normally below, and then it would be returned down to the fabric. So we would see a little bit of a line where while the extra yarn was being woven into the other fabric. Velvet is, certainly easy enough to identify. I will mention there's a couple of types of velvet. You might see crushed pile velvet. That's where we just sort of randomly flatten the pile, kind of wrinkle it up. And it sounds like a terrible idea, but actually it's really great for upholstery because if somebody sits on it and kind of crushes it in one direction or the other, you can't really tell. I know that I had a crushed pile ice blue where it was used for the drapery of my box bed that I had as a child, a medieval style box bed, I know. And these ice blue drapery, when I was in junior high, I was the costume designer for, what was that? Was it the Merchant of Venice? And so I used it to make the costumes, right? So all of the nobles in this Shakespeare play had ice blue. We just pretended it was like their house color. Then I got seersucker drapes for my box bed, which is a different a different lecture. And of course, we could flatten all the pile in just one direction. Again, great for upholstery. Think kind of like a teddy bear, right? And that's called pané. So that is the second method of making a pile. There's a third method, which was developed again, typically because it could be used with a hand loom, and this is called an over wire method. And so this is where a wire is inserted and is used to pull up warp yarns, and then the fabric is beat, right? So you would basically weave a filling yarn, stick this wire rod in, right? Weave another filling yarn, lift up the wire as high as you needed. Well, the cool thing about this is you can do it in a line straight across, or you could actually weave the wire in going diagonally and lift up pile in a different direction, right? So we can create kind of sculpted pile. It's again very often used for upholstery or rugs, right? Because these loops, the hand weavers could make these dense loops. Frisé is the name of one that we see in, for example, types of carpeting or grosse point. When I look at pictures of frisé, I actually remember a sofa that my elementary school piano teacher had. She lived in the retirement apartments that were attached to the Methodist Church on Pine Street there in Boulder. And they had this kind of home for the elderly, Methodist widows, I believe. And so she had an apartment in that building, and she would give me stale, but I still just remember the sweetness of it, right? But stale Girl Scout cookies. Her whole apartment kind of vaguely smelled of mildew. And I would sit on this kind of musty smelling frisé sofa, laying on my stomach reading a book while my brother was practicing getting his piano lesson, and then it would be my turn. So I remember having my nose quite close to a frisé sofa, which would have been very popular in the 50s. So if you're an interior designer and you're doing kind of a mid-century modern, you might look out some of this fabric. Now, I mentioned terry cloth at the very beginning. This is, in fact, a type of pile. It uses a whole different set of weaving, right? So the first two that I talked about, warp and weft piles, just involved this third set of yarns. The over-the-wire method just involved warp and filling, only we're pulling up warp yarns using these wires. And slack tension weaving is very similar to that same method. We only have two sets of yarns, only we actually will have a loom that's designed so that some of the yarns have lower tension than others. Well, how would we do this? We would do this by having two warp beams that are actually held at different tension, right? And that we could actually just use a pedal to relax the tension or tighten the tension. So when both of the yarns are equally tense, we can weave in a filling yarn, right? And beat it. And now that filling yarn forms kind of a little valley, right? But then we can put the second filling yarn, maybe an inch above the first filling yarn, right? And, it's woven in there, right? We'll switch the harnesses, so now that filling yarn is good and secure in there. Only when we beat it, right, we release the tension on the one warp beam, and those warps that are now caught by the filling yarns are actually scrunched. It's basically like ratting your hair, right? You hold some of the hair and you pull with the comb and you rat some and it kind of sticks out on either side. That's what happens with slack tension weaving. And we can either leave the loops on the surface because these warp yarns just bunch up to form little loops, or we can cut them. The quality on terry cloth, just FYI, if you're ever putting terry cloth on your a gift registry list, for example, for a life change, it's very common for graduation gifts or engagements, etc. Don't go by how soft the towels feel. That's just created by chemicals that are added to the towels at the point of sale. It'll come out. Dig in and look down at the base of the loops and see how tightly woven the ground is and the density, how many loops are sticking out of how many interlacings. You really want to see basically every interlacing having a loop coming out of it almost, right? That's a high quality terry cloth towel. Me personally, I don't use terry cloth towels because I've gotten used to flat woven towels, sort of Turkish style, that don't lint as much because I got tired of the dust and the lint. All right, kind of personal, but people ask me what's my opinion about textiles. So we have a third set of yarns that we can do in either the warp or filling direction. We have over the wire. We had slack tension weaving. And now we have what are called pile effects. And this is where I can get into carpet. So pile effects are a low-cost alternative to actually weaving. This isn't weaving I'm going to be talking about here. The idea is that we take a backing fabric, usually a loosely woven made with very inexpensive yarns, made of jute, for example, like a burlap fabric. And we use a special needle, a punch needle, that has, we basically stick the head of the needle with the yarn in it through the fabric. And then we grab the yarn off of the head of the needle and hold it while we pull the needle back. So imagine, people do this as a hobby, right? We invented a machine to do what people were doing by hand. But you punch with the punch into the fabric, and in many cases, what will happen if you have a special punching tool, you have a little collar that controls how far you can punch the needle in, and then you just grab the yarn from the tip of the needle and pull it back out, and as you pull it, the yarn stays looped on the front side. So you're punching from the back, and so you can have the back of the fabric painted with a design, maybe a kitten and a little basket with a ball, right? And so you're punching the blue, right, for the ball, or the pink for the collar of the kitten, and you follow the line and punch into every interlacing to create a loop of that particular color on the other side. We could do this on a bedspread where it's called candle wicking, and so we might use a white yarn on white fabric and make kind of white lines, right? And this was a very popular type of bedspread in the early 20th century, sometimes called a chenille bedspread. Of course, if you used chenille yarn, that would make sense, but you could just use any old yarn. It's not, that isn't what chenille is. Chenille is a type of yarn, but if you called it a chenille bedspread, you could understand why. It's a tufted bedspread. You don't have to use white. You can use colors and make, designs, roses, peacocks, right? So this tufted pile was originally used for things like rugs and a type of tapestry. At the Dovecot Tapestry Center in Edinburgh, we actually saw someone tufting a huge tapestry. This was so cool. They used a pneumonic, so it used air, high-powered air, and they would thread the tip of this machine with the yarn, right? So it had a punch needle that had thread in it, and then they would place it against the back of the fabric and pull the trigger, and they'd adjusted the depth, right? So let's say they were tufting the leaves on a tree, right? And the trunk of the tree they tufted shorter, and the leaves of the tree they tufted taller. And so they set the machine so that it actually went, that when they pulled the trigger, the needle went boom out from the machine, kind of like a bolt gun, only it's a needle gun. Ooh, murder mystery. And at any rate, sorry, I just had a whole episode in my head of a murder mystery set in Edinburgh with a killer tapestry artist. At any rate, there were clues left in the tapestry. So the tufting needle would go through the fabric, carrying the yarn, and then the needle is pulled out from the back and pressed against the fabric in the next spot, and the yarn is again pierced through the fabric. This loop is formed, right, with the yarn left on the other side. And so this method can be used to make these gorgeous artworks. The cool thing is that after they're done, the artist will come around to the front side, climb up a big ladder, and use a pair of scissors to very carefully shape the pile. So I mentioned like bark on a tree, right? They'll follow the lines of the color and carve some of the pile to be shorter than others to give it a rounded shape, right? So literally, it's like a shaped surface. But if we're just talking carpeting, this is done by a huge machine, so hundreds of needles all in a row that just go bang through the fabric. The fabric is woven like literally right before it gets to the rows of needles. And then just have somebody with a tufting gun who's watching it go, just adding in a a little bit of a pile here and there anytime the machine misses for some reason. If a loop doesn't go all the way through or pulls back, they can add it back. So 95% of carpeting is manufactured using this tufting method, and it's very common. And like I said, you can do gorgeous designs with it, but in carpeting situations, they're mainly just tufting, repetitive patterns. But still, right? It's can be pretty cool, right? You can have the one needle with the one color, and then it pulls back, and a different needle with a different color pops forward, right? So you can program the computer that runs the machine to create endless color variations. If you've ever been in a casino hotel, you know what I'm talking about, right? The amazing nature of carpet in Las Vegas. It is like you could just spend days wandering the halls of those buildings looking at the carpeting. If you're into textiles, I guess. Let's talk a little bit about carpet quality. If you're looking at some carpet and you want to know if it's good carpeting or not, the first thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be looking to see if the pile is tall and dense, right? The higher the pile and the more dense it is, the higher quality the carpet. You want to check the fiber content to make sure that the fiber content is what you expected. If you're paying a lot of money for a wool carpet, you don't want to get tricked by a polypropylene carpet. Additionally, you can take a look at the twist of the yarns. Very tall twist yarns, very loose twisted yarns are a great way to trick people into thinking the carpet is really dense when in fact it's just lots of loose fibers that are going to end up getting sucked up into the vacuum cleaner. And lastly, you're going to want to take a look at the primary and secondary backing. So the primary backing is the fabric that the carpet was tufted into. Typically, as I mentioned before, made from jute or occasionally polypropylene, very inexpensive fabrics. No big deal there, but you just want to make sure that it's tightly woven enough. There should be a layer of latex, sort of a glue coating between the primary and secondary backing. So you're going to want to peel that backing back and check to see that the glue is thick enough and that it's spongy enough. That's part of what gives the carpet its bounce. And if that latex dries out too quickly, the pile can be pulled loose and also just cause its own dust. So you want to make sure that they chose a really good coating in there. And all of that contributes to the quality of a carpeting. And lastly, besides tufting, we can create another pile effect that's an even lower cost alternative, which is basically to coat fabric with glue and then sprinkle the pile on. It's called flocking, and flocking is a pile-like texture that was produced by gluing or adhering using adhesive these very short fibers to the surface of the fabric. So if we look at the backside of a woven fabric, pile fabric like velvet, we don't see anything on the backside. We just see the woven ground. If we look on the backside of a tufted fabric, we see a set of yarns that kind of look like stitches. This is when the yarns were moved from one interlacing to the next to be inserted into the fabric as a tuft. But with a flocked pile, we won't see anything on the back, right? Because all the fibers have been glued onto the front side. Very low abrasion resistance, low quality. The pile is necessarily very short because it was literally just sprinkled on. Did you ever make a card for your dad or mom when you were in elementary school and you put like a picture with glue and then you sprinkled glitter on it, right? And then you shook it, right? And after it had dried just a tiny bit and all of the extra glitter shook off. Kind of what we do here. We put glue on the fabric and then we sprinkle using it's literally called a flock hopper. We sprinkle the flocking onto the surface, beater bars underneath, bounce it up and down to try and get the fibers to stand up straight. And then after it's had a moment to dry, this big suction hood sucks up the extra pile. Can't really be reused because now it's got glue on it, but these extra fibers were just chopped up yarn, right? That are fibers that were glued to the surface. It's going to be used for maybe upholstery fabrics, Velux blankets. They're foam with this pile glued to either side. nice and warm, soft and fuzzy. I guess nicer than just pulling up a piece of foam over yourself, but not at all an actual velvet blanket. And so really, in lots of ways, kind of a depressing fabric. We'll talk again about flocking when we discuss some other finishes that might use flocking, but I just want to mention now that flocking can be used to imitate pile weaves like velvet, only when you take a look at it, you can just pull the fibers right out of the glue. It's a very poor imitator. In the next episode, I will discuss textured weaves and double cloths, and that will be the end of our fancy weaving journey.